Now we're going to turn to Daf Mem Dalid Amid Beis, and the Gemara says, "Va'ika ha'mayla." The Gemara continues to ask a kasha: if b'shas avoda lifnai v'lifnim, there's no requirement to prisha ben ulam l'mizbeach, and that makes no difference between whether it's the shas haktoras lifnai v'lifnim or the shas matan domim lifnai v'lifnim. So why does the Brisa mention, in comparing and contrasting the Heichal with the Bein Ulam Mizbeach area and the special mile of the Heichal, it only mentions the Ktores Lifnai V'Lifnim Ha'ika HaMaila Te'ilu Meheichal Parshi Bein B'Kedusha Didei Bein B'Kedusha D'Lifnai V'Lifnim Ve'ilu Mibein Ha'ulam Mizbeach Lo Parshi El B'Kedusha De'Heichal. Why doesn't the Brisa, or I should say the Mishnah, emphasize the contrast between Heichal and Ulam L'Mizbeach with regard to the Matan Domim? That with regard to Prisha in the Heichal, we require that Prisha, whether it's B'Shas Matan Domim in the Heichal, and even if the Matan Domim is all the way inside, in the Lifnai V'Lifnim, in the Kosh Kadashim, we require Prisha from the Heichal. But as far as the area of Ben Ulam Mizbeach, we only require Prisha when the Matan Domim is in the Heichal, but not in the Kodesh Kadashim. If the Matan Domim is in the Kodesh Kadashim, then there is no requirement of Ben Ulam Mizbeach. And if we would reject Rabbi Elazar, and we would say that there was a din of Prisha Ben Ulam Mizbeach during the time of Haktar Lifnai V'Lifnim, then when there's Matan Domim Lifnai V'Lifnim, then there's no Prisha. And then we don't have this extra Maila in the Heichal. But once we apply the principle of Rabbi Lazar, we should have added that additional Maila of Heichal over Ben Ulam Mizbeach in terms of Matan Domim. That when there's a Matan Domim Lifnai V'Lifnim, there's no din of Prisha other than the Heichal, but not in Ben Ulam Mizbeach. And if there would be Matan Domim in the Heichal, then we require Prisha from Ben Ulam Mizbeach. Amar Rava, Shem Prisha Achasi. There's no need for the Mishnah to mention both Ktores and Matan Domim, because it's all one Shem Prisha. In other words, the Prisha during the time of the Ktores and the Prisha during the time of Matan Domim are all one din. And once the Bryce had mentioned that there's a difference between Heichal and Ben Ulam Mizbeach as far as Prisha B'Shas HaKtorah Lifnai V'Lifnim Mela, we also know that that same difference and contrast applies during the Matan Domim Lifnai V'Lifnim, that there's a special mila to the Heichal that generates a Chiyuv Prisha, whereas there's no Prisha Ben Ulam L'Mizbeach. So the Brysa only mentions Haktorah, not Matan Domim, because the pasuk itself is referring to the Ktores, as we saw in the Gemara Nomen Aleph. Omar Mar, we saw in the Brisa, and we'll read the whole part of the Brisa. It says, "Kishem sheparshim ibein ulam lemizbeach b'chas haktorah." Kach parshim b'shas matan par kohen Mashiach upar helim dover shel tzibor seirecha ovdei kochavim. And during all these chatos pnimius, when there's a Matan Domim in the Heichal, there's a din of Prisha bein ulam lemizbeach, and the Gemara asks me no. In other words, we derive the Chiv Prisha from Kol Adam Lo Yibol Moed Bivo Ol Chaper Bakodesh. I'd say so, and that pasuk is referring to the kapara of the Ktores and the Matan Domim of the parents Soyer and Yoma Kippurim. How do we know to extend it to other cases of Matan Domim in the Heichal, in the cases of the Chatos Pnimius? How do we know that that generates a Chiv Prisha? Omer Rav Pedas, Asya Kapor Miyom Kippurim. We have a Gzeir Shava of Kapor in the din of Prisha. At the time Matan Domim and Yom Kippurim, it says Bivo Ol Chaper, and we already learned on Amud Aleph that that's a din of Prisha during the time of Matan Domim, of Parvus Soyer, of Yom Kippurim. And with regard to other Parim and Seirim, which are Pnimios, what we call the Nisrafim. There too, it used the word kapara with regard to the Seirei Avodas Kochav Mitzes, Midbar Tezva, V'chiper HaKohen al kol adas b'nei Yisrael. And also, with regard to the Parahelim Dov Shel Tzibur, it says in Vayikra Dal V'chiper Aleim HaKohen. It doesn't say V'chiper with regard to Par Kohen Mashiach, but nevertheless we derive Par Kohen Mashiach from Par Helim Dover, because with regard to Par Helim Dover, it says V'asol Apar Kasher Asol LePar Chatos Ken Yasel Lo V'chiper Aleim HaKohen V'nislach Lahem. And in this pasuk, we're talking about Par Kohen Mashiach. So therefore, we learn from that even B'shas Matan Damim of the Par Kohen Mashiach, we have a din of prisha. And that din of prisha, as we said before, applies Bein Ulam L'Mizbeh. Amar Rav Acha bar Ava. We saw in Masechet Kelim that there's a din of prisha in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach. There's no din of prisha with regard to the rest, the balance of the Azor Shema Minah, Milos da Oraisa. That which we learned in the Mishnah in Kelim, that there are various Milos in the Beis HaMikdash. We have Har Bayis, which is more sanctified than the entire city of Yerushalayim. And, for example, Zavim, Zavos, Nidos, V'yoldos have to be excluded from the Har Bayis. Then we have the Chel, which is even a higher sanctity than the Har Bayis, and Tmei Mesim or Goyim are not allowed to enter into the Chel. And then we get to the Ezras Noshim, which is even higher sanctity. A Tful Yom is not allowed to go in there. And then we get to the Ezras Yisrael, which has a high level of Kedusha, because a Mechusa Kapora is not allowed to enter into the Ezras Yisrael. And if he does, then he or she, then there's a Chiv Chatos. Then we get to the Ezras Kohanim, which is even more sanctified than the Ezras Yisrael, because Yisraelim are not allowed to enter into the Ezras Kohanim unless they need to do a smich on a korban or shchita or tnufa. Then we get to the higher level of Kedusha, Bein Ulam Mizbeach, that Bali Mumim and Purei Rosh are not allowed to go into the area between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. Then the Heichal is more sanctified than Bein Ulam Mizbeach, and there we can't go in without what's called Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Then we get to the Kodesh Kadoshim, which is more sanctified than the Heichal, and no one's allowed to go in there except for the Kohen Gadol once a year, b'shas avoda. So let's derive that this is all da'oraisa. The entire Mishnah is setting up different milos da'oraisa. V'achi gmirale. And it was halacha l'moshe misinai, that each chelek has a greater sanctity than the other. The Isal Kadat the Rabbana, and if you're going to tell me that all these milos are only rabbinic in origin, they're not da'oraisa. And as far as da'oraisa is concerned, the Kedusha of the area Bein Ulam Mizbeach and the rest of the Azara is one Kedusha. Is Maishna Bein Ulam Mizbeach Dilma Mikra V'Aili Mikuli Azara Nami Nifreshu Dilma Mikra V'Aili. If it's all the Rabbana, so as far as the Torah is concerned, there's no difference between the Kedusha of Bein Ulam Mizbeach and the Kedusha of the Azara. So why is it that the Chacham made a Gzeira and they required Prisha in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach? If Bein Ulam Mizbeach has the identical Kedusha of the Azar itself, then the whole Azar should be included in this Gzeira. You're afraid that maybe he'll go into the Heichal inadvertently, so you should apply that to the entire Azara. Dilma Mikra V'Aili. Maybe inadvertently they'll enter B'shogeg into the Heichal, and according to Torah law, you're saying the entire Azara has one Kedusha, including Bein Ulam Mizbeach, is the Din Prisha should apply both to equally to the entire Azara as it does to Bein Ulam Mizbeach. But rather, if we're going to say that this is a Maila de Rabbanon, so then we could say that the Rabbanon were only goes a Din Prisha in the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach. And to add another Gzeira in the area beyond the Mizbeach, which would mean during the Azara, that would already be a Gzeira l'Gzeira. We have principle Ein goes to Gzeira l'Gzeira. Now the Gemara rejects it. And in truth, we could say that these milos are drabban. The Raisa, you're right. It's one identical kedusha, and there's no difference between the Bein Ulam Mizbeach area and the entire Azor. However, Bein Ulam Mizbeach came the mafsik midi. Came the low mafsik midi. In other words, you flow from the area to Bein Ulam Mizbeach right into the Eichel. And Lo Minkar Milsa, there's nothing to remind them, and they might therefore enter in to the area of the Heichal from the Ulam and on, Bishogeg. But with regard to the balance of the Azor, the rest of the Azor, Keva the Ikum Mizbeach Achitz on the Mafsik, Minkar Milsa. You see the end of the Mizbeach, we're talking about the Mizbeach Achitzon, of course, and that sort of sets up a natural separation between that area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach and the Azara, and it's Minkara Milsa. So that if you're talking about the area of the Azara, it's, let's say we're going east of the Mizbeach, then it's Minkara Milsa. And no one's going to come to enter into the Heichal from that area because they see where the Mizbeach ends. So there's a natural simon or heker or separation. Omar Rava, from the din of Prisha, Ben Ulam Mizbech Shmamina, Keduchas Ulam Vehechal, Chada Milsahi, that the Ulam has the sanctity of the Heichal. It's one sanctity. Now, the Beis HaMikdash had 100 amas in length, and it begins in the east, and there you get to the Ulam that had a width of 16 amma, if you include the Koseo Ulam. And afterwards, on going towards the west was the Heichal. And if you calculate the Heichal together with the Kosel Heichal, that's 46 amma. And at the end of the west, you keep going west, you get to the Kosh Kadoshim, which together with its solim, its walls, and the Ta, beyond that's Shloshim V'Shmona Amos. So now you could raise the following question. If the area of the Ulam has one identical Kedusha with the Heichal, shall we say that the Ulam and the Heichal are one, or can we say that the Ulam has its own Kedusha? It doesn't have really the status, the din of a Heichal. Rava wants to prove from the fact that Chachamim made a Gzeira and they required Prisha ben Ulam Mizbeach, that the Ulam in fact has a Kedushas Heichal. Because this din of Prisha is Doraisa, but only with regard to the Heichal, where it says Kol Adam Lo Yeh Ba'ol Moed B'Vo L'Chapra Kodesh. Ol Moed is reference to the Heichal, so the Chiyuv Prisha is in the Heichal. If the Ulam is included in Heichal, then we understand that the Chachamim got up and they made a Gzeira and they required Prisha ben Ulam L'Mizbeach because he might go into the Ulam. But Isal Kedaita, take Kedushos Ninu. If you're going to tell me that the Heichal has one Kedusha and the Ulam has its own independent Kedusha, they're two separate Kedushos, then Ulam Gufe Gzeira, the din of Prisha that applies to the Ulam itself is only D'Rabbanan, because the Torah says Lo Yuchal Kol Adam Lo Yeh Bi Oel Moed. Oel Moed is reference to the Heichal and not to the Ulam, according to that side which Rav is rejecting. Is Anan Nekum V'Nigzar Gzeira L'Gzeira? Is it possible that we will now add the area of Bein Ulam L'Mizbeach as a Gzeira to the Ulam when the Ulam itself is not included in the Doraisa? That's a double Gzeira. And the Gemara rejects this. Lo, there's no proof that the Kedushas Heichal and the Kedushas Ulam are in fact one Kedusha. We could say the following. Ulam ubein Ulam L'Mizbeach Chada Kedushi. In fact, the Ulam has the identical Kedusha as the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach. Basically, it's one Kedusha. Whereas Kedushas Heichal v'Ulam Shtei Kedushas. We're not going to integrate the Ulam into the Kedushas Heichal, but rather the Ulam remains outside the Heichal as far as its Kedusha is concerned. It's part of the area of Bein Ulam Mizbeach. And the din of Prisha from the Ulam is not Doraisa. That itself is Gzeres Chacham. And yet you'll ask me, why are we including the area of Ben Ulam Mizbeach and that Gzeira? Why isn't that considered Gzeira? Gzeira, the answer is because since the Ulam and Ben Ulam Mizbeach is one Kedusha, therefore it's Kula Chad Gzeira. It's one Gzeira. Now we learned in our Mishnah back on Daf Mem Gimel that B'chol Yoma Yachota B'Shal Kesef Umara B'Toch Shel Zav, that the Avoda required that they, although they did the original chipui of the gecholim in a pan that was made of silver, then they would pour it into a pan of zav. Why did they do such thing? My timer. Why did they bother going through this whole rigmarole of starting with a machta of kesef? Just go straight to the, to the zav. And the Gemara answers, Shator Chasal Mamonam Shel Yisrael. And this introduces the concept of shchika. Shchika means that because of the hot coals, it's going to somehow cause abrasiveness. It's going to cause some sort of integration of the metal pan over the course of time. And if that metal is made of kesef, that's a lot less expensive to replace than zav. So the Torah has Rachmanis on the finances of Israel. The Mishnah says, Hayom, on Yoma Kippurim in Kanshas Chotes Shel Zav, Ubah Yamachas. There was no beginning of a process of a machta shel kesef and then pour it into a machta shel, pour the gecholim into a machta shel zav. My time mishum chulsha the Kohen Gadol. We want to minimize the effort of the Kohen Gadol. He's very weak. He's got a tinus and he's doing all these avodos. So therefore, they made it easy for him. Instead of having to do an irui to pour the gecholim from one machta to another, they said, you know what? Let's just start with Shel Zahav. And they weren't worried about, on one day of the year that that the gecholim will in any way destroy or damage the machta shel zav. The Mishnah says, "B'chol yom b'shal arba kavim." He would be chota 4 kavim of gecholim, and then he would pour them into 3 kavim. Whereas on Yom Kippurim, he was chota 3 kavim. And that's what he went into the Kodesh Kadosh with the 3 kavim. Rabbi Yotzi, on the other hand, says on every day of the year, he was chotev b'shel sa'a, and then he was marah b'toch shlosha kavim. Gemara brings a brisa, Tana. We learned in Masechet Tamid, B'shah at the time that he was ma'ara, that he poured the gecholim from the machta of 4 kavim into the machta of 3 kavim, is nispazru lo kav gecholim, and now there's one kav that just simply falls away because he's pouring it into 3 kav. He's only pouring 3 kav. So where's the extra kav? Mechabdon li'am. They clear out these gecholim into this silon shel mayim berochav am. It was like a stream of water that was one amma wide, and it went through the Azara, and it emptied out into Nachal Kidron. He says the following give you the English translation. He says that that a coal of a kav was worth of coals become scattered through the pore. He clears them into a canal. He calls it a canal that runs through the Azara. Now, a kav of coals is scattered because he's pouring from 4 kavim shovel into a 3 kavim. The canal into which they are cleared is that which flows from the Azara to the Nachal Kidron, as we said earlier, in the name of Rashi. Toni Chada, we have one brisa that says kav, that he was mafazer he was scattering a kav. The Tanya, we have another brisa that says kabayim. It was actually 2 kavim that was scattered. So the Gemara says bishlei mahachtu toni kav. I could understand the brisa that says that they scattered one kav, and that's going to reflect the sheet of the Rabbanon in our Mishnah that says he was chotu b'shel arba kavim and maral l'machta shel shlosha kav. So there's one kav that was scattered. Elahachta tani kabayim, but the brisa that says that there were two kavim that were scattered is mani. Whose sheet does that reflect? Lo Rabbanon, v'lo Rabbi Yossi. It's not the Rabbanon who have one kav, and it's not Rabbi Yossi who says in our Mishnah that on a daily basis they were chotu b'shel sa'a, which is 6 kavim, and then they put it into shlosha kavim. So it means that from 6 to 3, there were 3 kavim that were scattered. Omer Rav Chizda, who is the author of this brisa, Rabbi Shmuel Benosha, Rabbi Yochanan Broki, the Sanya, we learned to the brisa, Rabbi Shmuel Benosha, Bishel Kabayim Hoyamachnis, the machta of Zav, which he was machnis, into which he was machnis, the gecholim was shnei kavim. And now he was chota arba kavim, according to the chachamim, and now he's pouring it into shnei kavim, a machta shel zav of shnei kavim. So he started with 4 kavim, he ended up with shnei kavim. So it turns out that there are 2 kavim that are scattered. Now Rav Ashi Omar, a different answer to this question. Afilu tema, I can reconcile this price with Rabbi Yossi. V'hachi kamar, and this is what Rabbi Yossi had in mind. B'chol yomay yachota v'shel sa midbaris. He used a machta that would hold a volume of a saw, which has 6 kabim, according to the midah back at the time of the midbar. And when they came to Yerushalayim, they added to the midos 1/6, the shtus. And that means that the saw Yerushalmis was greater than the saw midbaris by 1/6 of a saw Yerushalmis, which is 1/5 of the saw midbaris. So the saw midbaris is 5 kavim Yerushalmis. And then ma'ar l'toch machta amachzika shlosha kavim Yerushalmis. So it comes out that there were 2 kavim that were scattered around. So with regard to the machta that they used, shechatubo nokaratana saw midbaris, because kol shiurei chacham b'stam heim mida midbaris. That's a Mishnah in Kalim. But then he mentions shlosha kavim Yerushalmios in order to teach us the shir in its precise form. In the mida midbaris, that shir would not be ola to the same kavim shlemim. It would be more than shlosha kavim, and it would be less than 4 kavim. But he mentions the Mid Yerushalmis, which is kavim shlemim. Now the Gemara explains the difference between the shape of the machta on Yom Kippurim as opposed to the rest of the years. We saw in our Mishnah, B'chol Yom Haisa Kveda. The machta was very heavy. Vayom Kala, but on Yom Kippur it was light. Oh no, we learned in the Brisa, B'chol Yom Haisa Gilda. The defanos, the karkios of the machta was very thick, so that it would last a long time without getting broken. Vayom, on Yom Kippurim, Rach, it was very thin to make it light and make it easier for the Kohen Gadol to carry with the gecholim inside. B'chol Yom, the Mishnah says, Haisa Ktsara. The yad of the machta was relatively limited in size, Ktsara. Ve'ayom Arucha. But on Yom Kippurim, the handle of this shovel was long. Why was it short the rest of the year and longer on Yom Kippurim? Aitaima Kedesha Teiz Rosh Al Kohen Gadol Misayat. That it would make it easier for the Kohen Gadol to hold on to this handle under his armpit, and that would make it easier for him to carry if he has this long arm of a shovel, a long handle. It's not a short handle, because then it would be impossible to put it under his arm. You get burnt by the tana. Brisa, Oyom lo haya ni ashtik. Ayom hayala ni ashtik. During the course of the year, there was no ring attached to the handle, but on Yom Kippurim, they attached a ring to the tip of the handle. Divrei Ben Skan. These are the words of Ben Haskan. And he says the following, that Hayom, on Yom Kippurim, it had this golden tabas that was on the head of the machta. And the reason for that is Hidei Shetik Kash, make a banging noise on the machta to be mashmiya kol, because when the Kohen Gadol was moving with the machta, there had to be a noise, as it says by the palmonim, the bells on the bottom of the me'il. It says v'nishma kolo b'vo al hakodesh v'nei ha'yishem. And here too, when he was carrying the machta, he would want to make this noise as well. Now, here in this long footnote that I have, he discusses this idea in great length. But let's just see if we can finish up the daf, and then maybe tomorrow we'll come back to this long footnote if we have time. Make a note of it. B'chol Yom, the Mishnah says, Hayazahavi Arok. The rest of the year, the zahav of the pan was green. And now green here really means yellow. I think we discussed this already. And there are many different types of zahav. There are 7 sorts of gold. There's regular gold zahav. The zahav tov is a more qualitative gold. Zahav ophir, the gold of ophir. Zahav mufaz, which is lustrous. Zahav shachut, which is shachut gold. And zahav sagur, which is closed gold. And zahav parvin. And Rav Chisda explains, Zahav is Zahav Tov Dichsiv. What's possible at the beginning of the Torah, it says, Uzav Haaretz Hahi Tov. In other words, in addition to the regular gold, there's a good sort of gold. It's not your ordinary gold. Zahav Ophir, the Osim Ophir, comes from a place called Ophir, this was a highly prized gold, and Melech Shlomo actually sends ships to Ophir in order to bring gold from Ophir. Zahav Mufaz, here on the top of Memheim and Aleph, is Shedome Lepaz. It resembles pearls in its luster. Zahav Shachut, Nitve Kechut. It can be spun like a thread. It's malleable. Zahav Sagur, closed gold. Bishosh and Niftach. In other words, as soon as you open the store, Kol Chanuyos Nisgaros. No one could compete with this gold. It's such a high quality gold. Zahav Parvayim is Shedom L'Dam Haparin. I guess in color, it resembles the blood of the bulls. He says that this kind of gold is the most esteemed of all the 7 types listed here in the ascending order of their value. Therefore, it's used for the machta that's brought into the Kodesh Kadosh. Rav Ashi Omar Chamishahem. And Rav Ashi has only 5 categories of gold. Kol chad v'chad isbei zav v'zav tov. Each one has both ordinary, regular gold and good gold. And now the Gemara has a brisa to prove that the Parvayim gold comes from the gold that resembles the blood of the Parim. Tanya nami hochi b'chol yom hayezahav yarok v'hayom adom v'hainu zahav parvayim shedome lidam haparim. So this is where we're going to stop here today on the top of Daf Mem Hey. Amud Aleph.